Hello, hello. Welcome to the September Purple Chair Chats. And y'all, real quick, I'm so sorry for the technical delays that we have experienced here. Thank you for your patience. There's nothing like doing something live for things to get weird, but at least we got it up quicker than that live Love is Blind that Netflix tried to do. But anyways, again, thank you for your patience. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome to September's Purple Chair Chat. If you are unfamiliar with this series, this is where us as Jana's campaign staff really work to instill the knowledge, skills, and values that are oh so necessary to prevent gender and relationship violence. And we do that by each month taking a closer look at a sub area within our work. So, for those of you I have not gotten to meet yet, my name is Megan Woodfield. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve Jana's campaign as the Education and Prevention Specialist. So, this month for September, our Purple Chair Chat is dedicated to suicide awareness and prevention. If you're unfamiliar, this month is Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. So we are going to be focusing on the history of this issue, how it connects in with gender and relationship violence, and then most importantly, what you can do to prevent it. So it's my hope that you find this content really engaging and helpful, and I'm definitely going to try to bring in some fun energy and vibes to it where I can. But this is a heavy topic. Like, this is a heavy subject, whether we are talking about gender and relationship violence, whether we are talking about suicidal ideation. And while I definitely applaud everyone who has jumped on and wanting to engage in this content, I'm really going to encourage you to do self-checks on whether this content is going to be too activating for you or not. If you are a primary or a secondary survivor of violence, if you or someone you know has struggled with depression or ideation, because we're going to talk in depthly about some of these topics, may not be the most comfortable for you. So I really want to encourage you to use your best judgment, take what you need in order to feel safe and secure, and know that in the chat right now there are lots of different resources that can help you, and I'm also going to go into some of those at the end. So you are not alone. We are here for you. If you need anything, please reach out to us at Jana's campaign, okay? So jumping into our content, I want to give a little bit of background because not everyone may be familiar with National Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. So September got this distinction in 2008. And since then, September has really become a time to acknowledge those who have been affected by suicide, to raise awareness about this important issue, and to connect individuals with treatment services. So schools do a really good job of this. Throughout the community, there's often lots of different events, and it's very, very needed because according to the CDC, we lose more than 41,000 folks every year by suicide. Suicide is also the 10th leading cause of death among adults in the US, and the second leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 24. And unfortunately, those rates have been increasing, especially coming off of the pandemic, where we were in a period of really intense isolation, massive loss, changes to routines. Now more than ever, being aware of that is super important, and being proactive and understanding what does it mean to help support someone, and what does that support look like. According to the World Health Organization, less than 25% of individuals will receive adequate treatment for depression. So that is really a lot of what brings us here today. We unfortunately have a culture that is very fearful of having open and honest conversations about mental health, self-support, and how to care for others. Which makes sense, right? Like, this is not the easiest thing to talk about, and I 100% get that. But we got to start getting a little bit comfortable in that discomfort, because the reality is that our people are suffering, and they're having to do so silently. So, a little bit of heaviness, but I want to walk through what some of these risk factors look like so that folks can be a little bit better prepared. And if you have questions about stuff as I go through this, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you're more comfortable direct messaging us a question, we'll get back to you, but I know there's a lot of content that comes in with this. So some risk factors for suicide and suicidal ideation. First one is depression. So mental health disorders, substance abuse disorders, specifically substances that act as a downer or a depressant, are going to make these symptoms worse. If there is chronic pain, personal or family history of violence, of mental health disorders, of substance use, or of course suicidality there, exposure to any sort of violence, whether it be family violence, gender and relationship violence, violence at the cause of a roommate can increase this. Also, presence of guns or firearms in the home, or having recently been released from prison or jail. It's a very sensitive time in folks' life. That transition can be really hard. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the symptoms of depression. My background is in psychology, for those of you who don't know that much about me. And I still, to this day, when I talk with folks, oftentimes hear people think of depression as just being really sad, like someone being really sad, really upset, and that's definitely a common symptom and an indicator there. But if we put depression into just that box, we are missing a lot of other factors. So in addition to that, it can look like someone just feeling empty. They don't really have a lot of interest in things, particularly things that they used to find super enjoyable. There might be a change rather significantly in their weight, whether that's loss or gain. Similarly with appetite, that can change those things around. Sleep is something that is so crucial for helping regulate our bodies emotionally, physically, all of those areas of wellness tie back in. So if there is insomnia or hypersomnia taking place, that is a risk factor. Irritability, loss of energy, and then of course feelings of like worthlessness, hopelessness, really feeling trapped in things, and also an inability to think or concentrate, which people sometimes don't think about, but oftentimes if you're having conversations with someone and they seem a little bit detached or a little bit aloof, that's where I would really empower you to ask some of those questions, and we'll get into some tips and tricks in terms of language and support of how we can talk with folks about this. But really asking those questions, because it doesn't always present in a sense of someone who is crying or someone who's really sad all of the time. There's lots of different ways that this can manifest. So asking those questions and getting curious if you're starting to notice some of these symptoms, even if they're not presenting in quite the way that you thought that they might. So thinking about the connection between these two things, if you were familiar with gender and relationship violence, then as I was going through some of those symptoms, you were probably like, okay, I'm starting to see how these bits get put together here. And a lot of research is going to support that as well. A lot of these warning signs are very compatible with the risk factors and signs of violence. And we see that causing a very heightened impact if there is duality in those experiences, so both things present within an individual. For women who are sexually abused, they show a 12 to 20% increase in suicide attempts. Child sexual abuse survivors show 150% increased risk of later suicidal behavior, which is a heavy one. I'm going to take my own advice and pause there for a moment. 23% of DV survivors have attempted suicide, and there's also a lot of research going on in states like North Carolina and Kentucky where they're trying to find more connection there so that we can get more access to resources, so that we can show people the importance of it, because this connection has been there for a long time, and these are obviously very high risk experiences that people are having. So being able to show, hey, this is how we can do something, this is how we can help, is super important. Another connection that can come in when we're looking at these two is if a partner is wanting to leave a relationship, sometimes the other partner might threaten, well, I'll kill myself if you leave me, or I would die without you, I don't know what I would do. Sometimes this is because that partner is in a very depressed, in a very heavy place, and if so, definitely a lot of support is needed there in connection to resources. But it's also sometimes done as a manipulation tactic to make the other person feel like they can't leave or they shouldn't try to get away from something that is unhealthy or abusive because of the harm it might cause. As we know, relationships that have unhealthy and abusive dynamics to them are very complex because there is some level of love there, otherwise they wouldn't be in the relationship. So being aware of that connection as well, is that something that can be really, really damaging, whether it is done truthfully or manipulatively. That's something that's very, very heavy to put on another person. So through all of this background that we've been gathering, starting to understand that there's definitely a need for collaboration and best efforts to support our people. And I've talked about a lot so far in the time that we have shared together, but I don't want this to be something that feels like, oh my gosh, there's so much happening, there's so much heaviness within this. Because in all actuality, suicide and gender and relationship violence are both 100% preventable. So I want to transition us into now talking, since we have this common language, we have a little bit of grounding here, things that you can do, things that we can do as a society, as a collective, to really help knock down some of the stigma that is present and get our people to a place where they're getting what they need, they're feeling better, they're feeling stronger, and we feel comfortable helping them and supporting them through it. So one thing that we're going to talk about first is wording and paying attention to language. And we're going to cover lots of different ways that you can be a part of this prevention movement, depending on your level of comfort and your level of time that you can give. So with the first one, paying attention to our wording, it's very common where people will use the phrase committed suicide to describe someone who has been lost due to this issue. And I really want to encourage switching that up and changing that, if that's something that you have heard used, or if that's something that maybe you have used in the past, and changing that to died by suicide or was lost due to suicide. Because if we're using the phrasing committed, right, that puts a lot of the emphasis on that person did harm to themselves and is really rooted in a victim blaming mentality. And I don't think that people do this intentionally, but because of the stigma that is around this issue, because it is so hard for people to reach out, if there is any kind of implication of putting that blame, putting that responsibility on the person who was struggling and didn't have access to what they needed in order to get help, that further creates more barriers and more stigma around it. So becoming aware of that and really challenging that kind of language. I've also heard before people who are trying to comfort someone who had a loved one who was lost due to suicide, talking about that person making a choice that was rude or that was selfish, or this idea of, well, like, how dare they do that to their loved ones and their family. And again, I don't want to tell anyone how to grieve or how to process. That is a hard thing to go through. Everyone is going to react and process that internally differently. But when we are talking about it, when we are talking to others about it, again, not putting the responsibility of harm on a person who is struggling and who is going through a lot, those simple changes can be so, so powerful when we're trying to help be that comfort person for someone who is struggling. And also as we work to kind of unlearn some of these bad habits that have been picked up in our culture because we didn't have access to education and the in-depth understanding of how this impacts folks. So those are a couple of language things that we can be aware of. Next is being familiar with different resources so that we can empower folks to use them. Recently, we got the longer suicide hotline number down to 998. So very similar to 911, which you would call in the case of emergency. Now we have that mental health emergency hotline number. And if you were someone who was really familiar with the 1-800-273-8255 number, that still works. You can use either or, but now we have that quicker response time. So in moments where people really directly need access quickly, we'll be able to have that. Something I actually just recently learned that I thought would be good to share with this too is if you're calling the hotline in either one of those forms, they actually have prompts where you can press different numbers and be connected to more specialized help depending on different needs that you might have. So, for example, those who have served in our military, coming back from that service can be really hard. They've seen a lot, they've gone through a lot, and so mental health is something that is very, very much needed in terms of support. So if you press one when you're calling that number, you can actually get connected to a veterans crisis line where they have staff who are trained specifically to help folks who have served. If you press two, you can get connected to a Spanish language line, and they actually have the ability to tele-interpret over 240 different languages through their different prompts. So if you are not a primary English speaker, if you have more comfort speaking in a different language, or if you are trying to help connect someone who maybe doesn't live in the States or does not speak English fluently, that is a really, really great option to be able to get some help. And they also have the option to press three, where you can be connected to a counselor that is specifically trained in supporting our LGBTQIA community. Again, a group of folks who has faced a lot of hardships for just trying to exist. So folks who are trained to specifically help them through that navigation. And the Trevor Project also has a really great hotline to help folks who identify in that way. And then, of course, the Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters, Jana's campaign, is nationally located in Hays, Kansas. So I always want to give those Kansas-specific numbers out to folks. You can reach them at 785-841-2345. In addition to all of those wonderful resources, other things that we can do. Becoming educated on trauma-informed care and empathetic listening. That language piece that I talked about moments ago, understanding how the brain thinks and reacts differently when you've experienced trauma, when you've experienced hardship, and being able to hold space for somebody in that way. And also having that knowledge for ourselves, right? Because the goal is to be able to be fully present if we are trying to be that support person and connect with resources and really hold space for somebody. But that can be hard for us to hear, especially if you are someone who has experienced any of these same things. You're coming up against your own barriers in that sense. So knowing how we can care for ourselves as well as we are processing that vicarious trauma, and also knowing some of those wording, some of those skills, so that we're really creating a comfortable speaking environment for the person who is sharing, and so that we can be a really effective listener for them. Taking any mention of suicide seriously. I know millennials and Gen Z, I think a little bit too, have this tendency to use like a darker sense of humor, or will joke around about stuff. And I transparently don't like that and understand that. I get that humor can be a form of trying to compensate if you're uncomfortable. But the reality is, if someone's mentioning suicide, if someone's mentioning wanting to harm themselves, there's often some level of that is true, whether they have a plan together of how they're going to do it, or it's just something that's in the back of their head. Asking questions about that and not letting that just be kind of brushed to the side, because someone who is mentally feeling very well, someone whose mental health is in a healthy place, is not going to be considering that. Volunteering at a local hotline or a mental health agency, especially during this month of September, there are so many different events. There's so many things that are going on, and really great ways to get involved. And then, of course, voting. In order for these community, school, different system-based resources to be able to do this important work, they have to have funding. So for service providers, really paying attention when you're voting in local, state, and national elections to candidates who are promoting that, and that's something that they want to do. Not only for our service providers, but that education, right? I mean, we are an education organization. I want our providers to have so much support and have everything that they need, and it's so important. But I would also really love to have more attention go to those proactive steps so that we can start reducing the amount of people who are needing to get services, right? And that comes through education, that comes through things like this, where we're sitting together, we're talking, and we're getting a little bit more information so that we are prepared for those things. So again, so much applauding to those of you who are watching this live with me or who are jumping in to watch this on the replay, because you are already doing some very beautiful and proactive steps here to help this. So as I start to wrap up, we're kind of coming to the end of our time together. If you or someone you know is struggling with ideation or has experienced gender and relationship violence, I want you to know that you are so deeply loved. You are so deeply believed. And when you are ready for help, when you want that, there are tons of people who are in the business of helping you. You do not have to go through this alone. And if you're unaware of who your local advocates are or how you can reach out to folks, again, please message us here at Jana's campaign. We are more than happy to help connect you. We know lots of hotlines, we've got lots of friends doing this work, and we don't want anyone who is struggling to not have access to what they need. I mentioned earlier the suicide hotline, that 988 number. We've shared in the chat other national and local resources, so please feel free to use them. Ask questions if things that have come up for you during this conversation. And again, just so much gratitude to y'all for joining us today in this conversation. That is all the time that I have. So once again, thank you for your patience with me. I am not a tech savvy queen, so there was a little bit of navigating that we had to do to get us up and live, but very important information, very good stuff. If you enjoyed this format, we do this monthly. So on October 16th, we will be right back here for our next Purple Chair chat, where we're going to be talking about DVAM, or Domestic Violence Prevention and Awareness Month, which is recognized in the month of October. So we'll have some really great stuff there. Once again, thank you so much for being here today. It's a beautiful day. I'm so glad you're here to see it, and I'm so glad that you spent some time with me. Bye, guys.